The wind howled across the Kansas prairie like a wounded animal, bending the tall grass until it looked like waves on an angry ocean. Emma Harper stood in the doorway of her weathered cabin, watching the storm clouds roll in from the west, dark and heavy with the promise of rain. Rain! The word felt almost sacred. After 3 months of drought that had turned the earth to dust and the creek to cracked mud, she was 15 years old and had been alone for 8 months now, ever since the fever took both her parents within days of each other. The neighbors, the Johnsons, lived 5 miles east, and the Crawfords another 3 miles beyond that. Out here on the edge of civilization, loneliness was as common as the wind, and Emma had learned to wear it like a second skin. The first drops of rain hit her face, cold and sharp. She should have felt relief, but something made her uneasy. The animals sensed it too. Her horse Copper was restless in the barn, stamping and snorting. The chickens had gone quiet hours ago, huddled together in their coop like they knew something was coming that had nothing to do with weather. Emma grabbed her father's old rifle from beside the door and stepped out into the rain. It came down harder now, soaking through her cotton dress and plastering her dark hair to her face. She made her way to the barn, her boots squelching in mud that hadn't existed an hour ago. The prairie was like that, feast or famine. Nothing in between. That's when she saw him. At first, she thought it was just a dark shape near the barn door. Maybe a fallen log or a sack of grain she'd forgotten. But then the shape moved just slightly, and Emma's heart jumped into her throat. She raised the rifle, her hands shaking not from cold but from pure terror. Out here, strangers meant danger. Always, don't move, she called out, her voice barely audible over the storm. But the figure didn't respond. As she moved closer, lightning flashed across the sky, and for one brilliant second she saw him clearly. A man, collapsed face down in the mud, his long dark hair spread around him like black water. Blood mixed with rainwater pooled beneath his body. Emma's first instinct was to run back to the cabin, bar the door, and pretend she'd seen nothing. That's what her mother would have told her to do. But her father's voice echoed in her memory, the last coherent words he'd spoken before the fever took his mind. We don't turn away from people who need help. That's what separates us from animals. She knelt beside the man, keeping the rifle within reach. He was breathing shallow and labored. She could see now that he wore buckskin clothing, beaded and decorated in patterns she recognized from the native tribes that used to pass through the territory before the government pushed them further west. His wrists bore deep rope burns, raw and infected. He'd been a prisoner. Recently, Emma knew the stories. She'd heard them whispered in town, at the general store, at church on Sundays. Colonel Vance Merrick and his riders had been rounding up any native people they found on what they claimed was settlement land, taking them to work camps or worse. Some said Merrick didn't even bother with camps anymore. He just made people disappear. The man groaned and his eyes flickered open for just a moment. They were dark and filled with pain, but also something else, a desperate, pleading question. Then they closed again. Emma made her decision in that instant. She couldn't lift him alone, but her father had built a cellar beneath the cabin for storing root vegetables and preserving food for winter. It was cool, dry, and hidden beneath a trapdoor in the kitchen. If she could get him there, no one would know. It took her nearly an hour to drag him through the mud, across the yard and into the cabin. He was unconscious, which made it easier in some ways and harder in others. She managed to open the cellar door and lower him down the wooden steps, half sliding, half falling. The sound his body made when it hit the earthen floor made her wince. She brought down blankets, water, and the last of her mother's medicinal herbs. She cleaned his wounds as best she could, her hands trembling the entire time. The rope burns were the worst, deep gouges that spoke of desperate struggle. He'd fought hard to escape. Somewhere out there, someone was looking for him. As Emma climbed back up the cellar stairs and closed the trapdoor, pulling the kitchen table over it, thunder shook the cabin walls. She sat in her father's rocking chair, still soaking wet, the rifle across her lap, and stared at the closed trapdoor. What had she just done? If Colonel Merrick found out she was hiding an escaped captive, she'd lose everything. The land, the cabin, maybe even her life. But when she closed her eyes, all she could see were those dark eyes looking up at her in the rain, asking a question she couldn't ignore. Outside, the storm raged on. And somewhere in the darkness, Emma knew riders were searching. They would follow the trail. They would come asking questions. And she would have to lie like her life depended on it, because it did. 3 days passed and the man in the cellar said nothing. Emma brought him water and broth, changed his bandages and watched as the fever that gripped him slowly began to break. He would wake sometimes, his eyes tracking her movements with a wariness that reminded her of a trapped fox, but he never spoke. She wasn't even sure he understood English. The rope burns on his wrists were healing, but slowly. Emma used her mother's salve, a mixture of honey, beeswax and herbs, and wrapped them in clean cloth torn from her old petticoats. Her mother had been the closest thing to a doctor for miles around, and Emma had absorbed everything she could, never imagining she'd need those skills so soon. On the 4th morning, Emma was mending a tear in her dress when she heard it, a low voice from the cellar, speaking words she didn't understand. She froze, needle in hand. Then came another sound, clearer this time, a single word in English. Water. Emma practically flew to the kitchen, grabbing the clay pitcher and a cup. She moved the table aside, opened the trapdoor and climbed down the narrow stairs. The cellar was dim, lit only by the light from above, but she could see him sitting up now, his back against the earthen wall. "Water," he said again, and she poured him a cup, watching as he drank it slowly, his hand still shaking slightly. "What's your name?" Emma asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. He looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding whether to answer. "Mankato," he finally said. "It means blue earth. I'm Emma Harper." He nodded slowly, wincing as the movement pulled at his injuries. "Why do you help me?" It was a fair question, and Emma found she didn't have a simple answer. "Because you needed help," she said finally. "And because it's the right thing to do." Mankato studied her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Your people do not usually think this way, especially not about my people." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks. She couldn't argue with that. "My father used to trade with the tribes that came through. He said there was honor in that. He said we were all just trying to survive on the same land. Your father was wise. Where is he now?" "Gone. Fever took both my parents last winter." Something shifted in Mankato's expression. "Then you are alone here, I manage. And now you risk everything for a stranger." Emma didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply said, "Can you tell me what happened to you?" Mankato was quiet for so long that Emma thought he wouldn't answer. Then he began to speak, his voice low and measured. He told her about Colonel Merrick and his riders, how they'd come to his camp claiming the land belonged to the railroad now, how they'd rounded up the men, saying they were going to work camps, but Mankato had seen the graves. He'd seen what really happened to people who went with Merrick. "I ran," Mankato said simply. "They caught me, tied me to a horse. For 5 days I looked for a chance. Then came the storm. The rope was wet. I broke free. They'll be looking for you," Emma said, though she immediately regretted stating the obvious. "They are already looking. They will come here. Then you need to heal faster," Emma said with a determination she didn't quite feel. "When you're strong enough, I'll help you get to the Crawfords. They're good people. They might help you get further west, away from Merrick's territory." Mankato shook his head. "Going west will not help. Merrick's territory is everywhere the railroad wants. I must go north to the reservation lands. My sister is there." Over the following days, an unusual routine developed. Emma would work her land during the day, feeding the animals, tending the struggling vegetable garden, repairing fence posts weakened by the drought. In the evenings, she would sit in the cellar with Mankato, bringing him meals and changing his bandages. They began to talk, carefully at first, then more freely. He told her about his life before the conflicts, about hunting buffalo that seemed to stretch across the horizon like a brown river, about the old ways his grandfather had taught him. She told him about her parents, about the dream that had brought them to Kansas, a dream of owning land, of building something permanent in a world that felt anything but permanent. "Your father's dream," Mankato said one evening. "It was built on land that was promised to us. Then the promise was broken." Emma felt shame curl in her stomach. "I know," she whispered. "I know it's not fair." "Fair is a word for children's games," Mankato said, but his voice wasn't harsh. "This is about survival now, for both our peoples." On the 8th day, Emma rode into town for supplies. She needed flour, salt, and medicine if she could afford it. The general store was busy, filled with farmers and their wives exchanging gossip and news. Emma kept her head down, gathering her items quickly, but she couldn't avoid hearing the conversations around her. "Colonel Merrick's offering a reward," Mrs. Patterson was saying to the shopkeeper. $50 for information about that escaped savage. Says he's dangerous, killed 2 men. Emma's blood ran cold. She gripped the flour sack tighter. $50, the shopkeeper whistled. "That's more than most folks make in 6 months. Someone'll talk. They're searching every homestead within 20 miles, Mr. Peterson added from the corner. "Going farm to farm. My place was searched yesterday." Emma forced herself to breathe normally, to keep her face blank. They were coming. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. But they were coming. She paid for her supplies with shaking hands and rode Copper home as fast as she dared without attracting attention. When she reached the cabin, she found Mankato already out of the cellar, standing by the window watching the horizon. "They are coming soon," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Emma confirmed. "They're searching every homestead. Mankato, you need to hide, deep in the cellar. Don't make a sound no matter what you hear." But Mankato shook his head. "If they search thoroughly, they will find the cellar. You will be punished for hiding me." "Then what do we do?" Mankato looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. "You tell them you have not seen me, and I make sure they believe you." Before Emma could ask what he meant, Mankato was moving, gathering his few belongings, wrapping his wounds tighter. "There is a cave," he said, 2 miles north where the creek bends. I saw it when I first came through this territory years ago. I will hide there until the riders pass." "You're not strong enough," Emma protested. "I am strong enough to survive. That is all that matters." They argued, but Mankato was determined. As the sun began to set, Emma watched him slip out into the twilight, moving like a shadow across the prairie grass. She stood in her doorway long after he'd disappeared, a wind picking up again, carrying the scent of smoke from somewhere far away. 3 hours later, she heard the horses. The pounding on Emma's door came just after midnight. She'd been sitting in the darkness, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but wait. When the sound shattered the silence, she jumped so violently that she nearly knocked over the oil lamp beside her chair. "Open up! Colonel Merrick's riders!" Emma's hands shook as she lit the lamp and moved to the door. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the wild beating of her heart. "Remember," she told herself, "you know nothing. You've seen nothing." She opened the door to find 5 men on horseback, their faces hard and weathered in the lamplight. The one in front, a lean man with a scar running down his left cheek, dismounted and pushed past her into the cabin without invitation. "You're the Harper girl?" he asked, his eyes already scanning the room. "Yes, sir. Emma Harper. I'm Deputy Carson. We're looking for an escaped prisoner, native man, dangerous. You seen anyone like that around here?" "No, sir," Emma said, proud that her voice barely trembled. "I've been alone here since my parents passed. I don't see many people." Carson's eyes narrowed. "That's so. When's the last time you went to town?" "This morning, to buy supplies at the general store. And you came straight back?" "Yes, sir." 2 of the other riders had dismounted now and were walking around the outside of the cabin, peering in windows, checking the barn. Emma watched them through the doorway, her stomach churning. "Mind if we look around?" Carson asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Of course not," Emma said. "I have nothing to hide." The men searched methodically. They went through every room of the small cabin, checked under the bed, looked in the wardrobe where her parents' clothes still hung. Carson's eyes lingered on the kitchen table, and Emma's heart stopped. Could he tell it had been moved recently? "What's under there?" he asked, pointing at the floor beneath the table. "Root cellar," Emma said, forcing herself to sound casual. "For storing vegetables and preserves." "Show me." Emma moved the table aside. It scraped loudly across the wooden floor, and lifted the trapdoor. The darkness below yawned like an open mouth. Carson held his lamp over the opening, and the light spilled down the stairs, illuminating the earthen walls, the shelves with their jars of preserved food, the pile of empty burlap sacks in the corner. "Get down there and check it," Carson ordered one of his men. Emma held her breath as the man climbed down. She could hear him moving around, shifting things. After what felt like an eternity, he called up, "Nothing down here but food and old blankets." Carson studied Emma's face for a long moment. You sure you haven't seen anyone? This man is extremely dangerous. He killed 2 of Colonel Merrick's men when he escaped. Emma felt sick. Mankato hadn't mentioned killing anyone. But she remembered, his words, Merrick says many things that are not true. I'm certain, sir, Emma said firmly. If I see anyone suspicious, I'll ride straight to town to report it. Carson seemed about to say something else when one of the riders called from outside. Deputy, found tracks leading north from here. Emma's blood turned to ice. The riders all moved to the doorway and she followed, watching as one of them crouched in the dirt with a torch, examining the ground. Looks like someone came through here recently, the man said. Prints are fresh, maybe a day or 2 old. Heading toward the creek. Carson turned back to Emma, his expression suspicious. Thought you said you hadn't seen anyone. I haven't, Emma insisted, but I can't control who passes near my land. This is open territory. People move through all the time. It was weak and she knew it, but Carson seemed to accept it, or at least couldn't prove otherwise. If you're lying to us, girl, you'll hang right alongside him when we catch him. You understand that? I understand, sir. The riders mounted their horses. We'll be back, Carson warned, and we're watching. If he shows up here, if you give him so much as a cup of water, you're done. Colonel Merrick doesn't tolerate traitors. Emma nodded mutely, and the riders galloped off into the night, heading north toward the creek. Toward the cave where Mankato was hiding. She stood in the doorway long after they'd gone, the lamp trembling in her hand. Should she warn him? But how? If she rode out now, the riders might see her, might follow her straight to him. But if she did nothing and they found him, Emma made herself go back inside, close the door and wait. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done. Dawn came slowly, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Emma hadn't slept. She'd sat by the window all night, watching for riders, watching for any sign. As the sun climbed higher, she saw something that made her stomach drop. Smoke. Thin columns of it rising from the north, from the direction of the creek. Emma grabbed her father's rifle and ran to the barn. She saddled Copper with shaking hands and rode north as fast as the horse could carry her. The smoke grew thicker as she approached, and she could smell it now, not just wood smoke, but something else. Something that made her eyes water. When she reached the creek, she found the riders camped there, their horses tied to scrub trees. They'd built a large fire and were standing around it talking and laughing. Carson saw her approaching and walked out to meet her. What are you doing here, girl? I saw the smoke, Emma said, trying to see past him. I thought maybe someone needed help. Just keeping warm, Carson said with a cold smile. Long night of searching, don't worry though, we'll find him. Nobody can hide forever. Emma looked past him at the smoke, at the burned grass spreading in a black circle around their camp. They'd set fire to the area, she realized, trying to flush out anyone hiding nearby. You should go home, Carson said, unless you have something you want to tell us. No, sir, Emma whispered. Nothing. She turned Copper around and rode back, slowly, forcing herself not to gallop, not to show the panic that was clawing at her chest. When she reached the cabin, she unsaddled the horse and went inside, closing the door behind her. That's when she heard it. A soft sound from the cellar. Emma's heart leaped into her throat. She moved the table aside and opened the trapdoor, and there was Mankato climbing up the stairs. His face was smudged with ash and his clothes smelled of smoke. You came back, Emma breathed. They were right there. They could have. They did not find the cave, Mankato said quietly. I heard them. I waited. When they lit the fire, I used the smoke as cover and came back through the grass. They're still out there, Emma warned. They're not giving up. Mankato nodded. I know, that is why I cannot stay here any longer. I am putting you in danger. Where will you go? North, to the reservation. It is 3 days' travel on foot, maybe 2 if I move fast. You need supplies, food, water. Emma, don't argue with me, she said firmly. If you're going to survive this, you need to be prepared. She spent the next hour gathering everything she could spare. Dried meat, bread, a canteen of water, extra bandages. She gave him her father's spare jacket and hat, hoping that from a distance he might pass for a settler rather than a native man trying to escape. As the sun began to set again, Mankato prepared to leave. They stood in the doorway together, looking out at the endless prairie. "Thank you," Mankato said simply. "You have given me something I had forgotten, hope." "Be careful," Emma whispered. "And when you reach your sister, tell her that not everyone has forgotten how to be human." Mankato smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. Then he was gone, slipping into the twilight like he'd done before, becoming one with the shadows and the grass. Emma watched until she couldn't see him anymore. Then she went inside, closed the door, and allowed herself to cry from relief, from fear, from the weight of what she'd done and what might still happen. 3 days later, the riders returned. But this time they weren't alone. Behind them, Emma could see orange flames licking at the sky. The valley was burning, and Colonel Merrick himself rode at the head of the column, his face like carved stone in the firelight. Emma smelled the smoke before she saw the flames. It came rolling across the prairie like a living thing, thick and acrid, turning the afternoon sky the color of rust. She'd been pulling water from the well when the wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of burning grass and something else, burning wood, buildings. She dropped the bucket and ran to the eastern edge of her property, shading her eyes against the sun. What she saw made her knees go weak. A wall of fire stretched across the horizon, moving slowly but steadily westward, toward her cabin, toward everything she had left. Emma had seen prairie fires before. Everyone who lived out here had, but this was different. This fire moved in a line, controlled and deliberate, and at the edge of that line, barely visible through the smoke, were riders on horseback, carrying torches. They were burning the valley systematically, methodically. Emma ran back to the cabin and grabbed the rifle, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. She had to think. The fire was still miles away, maybe 3 or 4, but the wind was blowing in her direction. She had maybe 2 hours, maybe 3 if she was lucky. Before the flames reached her land, she could run, pack what she could carry, saddle copper, and ride south toward town. Leave everything her parents had built, everything they'd sacrificed for. Or she could stay and fight, try to create a firebreak, hope that the flames would pass by or burn themselves out before reaching her cabin. Before she could decide, she heard horses approaching from the north. Emma's heart hammered as she recognized the riders, Carson and 2 of his men. But this time behind them rode a figure that made her blood run cold. Even from a distance, she could see the military bearing. The expensive horse, the rifle holstered at his side. Colonel Vance Merrick. They stopped 50 yards from her cabin, and Merrick dismounted slowly, deliberately. He was a tall man in his 50s, with silver hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they looked upon. When he walked toward Emma, Carson and the others flanked him like dogs at their master's heels. "Miss Harper," Merrick said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I'm Colonel Vance Merrick. I believe my men have visited you before." "Yes, sir," Emma said, forcing herself to stand straight, to meet his eyes even though every instinct screamed at her to look away. "Then you know why we're here. We're looking for an escaped prisoner, a dangerous man who's already killed 2 of my employees. My men tracked him to within half a mile of your property, and then the trail went cold." He paused, letting that hang in the air between them. "Interesting, don't you think?" "I don't know anything about that, sir." "I already told your men—" "I know what you told them," Merrick interrupted, his voice still calm but with an edge now, like a knife sliding from its sheath. "The question is whether you were telling the truth." Emma felt sweat trickling down her back despite the cool air. "Why would I lie, sir?" "That's what I'm trying to determine." Merrick walked closer, circling her slowly like a predator assessing prey. "You're out here all alone. Young woman, no family, struggling to hold on to this little patch of dirt." "It must be very hard. Very lonely. I manage, sir. I'm sure you do. But here's the thing, Miss Harper. This land you're standing on, it's been designated for railroad expansion. The Kansas Pacific is coming through, and they've purchased the rights to this entire valley. Your deed, I'm afraid, means nothing." Emma felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. "That's not possible. My father bought this land fair and legal. We have the papers," had the papers, Merrick corrected, "before the government renegotiated the boundaries. I'm sorry, but that's progress. The railroad is coming and it waits for no one." He gestured toward the fire burning in the distance. "We're clearing the land, making way for the future." "You're burning people's homes," Emma said, her voice rising despite her fear. "The Johnsons, the Crawfords, where are they supposed to go?" "They've been given notice. generous compensation for their land. Those who chose to accept it have already relocated. Those who chose to be stubborn, he shrugged. Well, the fire doesn't discriminate, Emma's mind raced. The Johnsons had 3 children. The Crawfords had just built a new barn last spring. All of it gone. For what? For a railroad that would bring more settlers. More people like Merrick, who saw the land as something to be conquered rather than lived with. Now, Merrick continued, his voice dropping lower, I'm going to ask you one more time. Have you seen or helped the escaped prisoner known as Mankato? Emma thought of those dark eyes looking up at her in the rain. Of the careful way Mankato had spoken about his sister. About the old ways his grandfather had taught him. Of the rope burns on his wrists and the quiet dignity with which he'd endured his pain. No, sir, Emma said clearly. I have not. Merrick studied her face for a long moment. Then he smiled, and it was somehow worse than his anger would have been. Very well. Then you have 2 choices, Miss Harper. You can accept my offer, $50 for this property, and safe passage to any town you choose, or you can stand here and watch everything you love burn to ash. This is my home, Emma said, her voice breaking despite her best efforts. My parents are buried here. Then I suggest you say your goodbyes. Merrick turned and walked back to his horse, mounting in one smooth motion. You have until the fire reaches your property line. After that, anyone found on this land will be considered a trespasser and treated accordingly. The riders turned and galloped away, leaving Emma standing alone in the yard. She watched them disappear into the smoke, her father's rifle heavy in her hands. For several minutes she just stood there, unable to move, unable to think. Then slowly purpose returned. She might not be able to stop the fire. She might not be able to save her home, but she could save something. Emma spent the next hour working frantically. She dug up her parents' grave markers, simple wooden crosses her father had carved, and wrapped them in cloth. She gathered the few precious things she had, her mother's wedding ring, her father's pocket watch, the family Bible with all their names written inside. She filled saddlebags with food and water, rolled up blankets, took every bit of money she'd hidden in the cabin. The smoke grew thicker, the air harder to breathe. Copper was restless in the barn, sensing the danger. Emma saddled him quickly, her hands working from memory rather than thought. She was loading the last of her supplies when she heard something that made her freeze. A sound from inside the cabin, a footstep. Emma grabbed the rifle and moved to the door, her heart pounding. Had one of Merrick's men stayed behind to watch her? But when she stepped inside, it wasn't a rider she found, it was Mankato. What are you doing here? Emma gasped. You should be miles away by now. I saw the smoke, Mankato said simply. I knew what it meant. I came back. That's insane. Merrick will kill you if he finds you here. He'll kill both of us, I know. But I could not leave you to face this alone. You risked everything for me. Now it is my turn. Before Emma could argue, they both heard it. The sound of horses returning. Emma ran to the window and felt her stomach drop. At least 20 riders now with Merrick at their head. And behind them the fire had grown closer, a towering wall of flame that seemed to consume the very air. They're coming back, Emma whispered. They must have seen you. Mankato moved to stand beside her at the window. Then we face them together. No, Emma said firmly. No, you need to run. Out the back, into the creek bed. The water will protect you from the fire. Go north like you planned. Find your sister, Liv, and leave you alone to face Merrick. I'll tell them you forced your way in. That I had no choice. They might believe me. Mankato looked at her with those steady dark eyes. You are brave, Emma Harper. Braver than many warriors I have known. But I will not run anymore. Not from this. The riders were getting closer now, spreading out in a line like they had when searching before. But this time Emma noticed something different. They weren't just searching. They were surrounding the property, carting off escape routes. They know, Emma breathed. Someone saw you come back. They know you're here, Mankato nodded slowly. Then we must decide. Do we surrender and hope for mercy from a man who has shown none? Or do we fight? Emma looked at the rifle in her hands, then at the fire consuming the valley, then at Mankato's face, proud and unafraid even in the face of impossible odds. My father used to say that some things are worth fighting for, Emma said quietly, even when you know you can't win, because the fight itself means something. Outside, Colonel Merrick's voice rang out across the yard. Miss Harper. I know he's in there, Send him out and I'll let you live. You have my word. Emma looked at Mankato one more time. Then she walked to the door and opened it, stepping out into the smoky afternoon air with the rifle across her chest. Mankato followed, standing beside her on the porch of the cabin that would soon be nothing but ash and memory. Your word means nothing, Colonel, Emma called back, her voice stronger than she felt. Just like your promises to the people who were here first. Just like your compensation for land that was never yours to sell. Merrick's face darkened. Last chance, girl. Step aside and let us take him. Emma raised the rifle, not pointing it at anyone but making her stance clear. This is my land, and he's under my protection. For a moment no one moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then Merrick raised his hand, and 20 rifles lifted in response. All pointed at the two figures standing together on the porch. So be it, Merrick said coldly. And then Emma heard something that changed everything, the sound of more horses coming fast from the south. She turned and saw them cresting the hill, at least 30 riders led by a familiar figure. Mr. Crawford, with his grey beard and worn hat, and beside him the Johnsons and dozens of others from surrounding homesteads. They rode between Emma's cabin and Merrick's men, forming a line of their own. Crawford dismounted and walked forward, his weathered face set with determination. That's far enough, Merrick, Crawford said. You've burned enough homes today, driven enough good people from their land. It ends here. The two groups faced each other across Emma's yard, 30 homesteaders against 20 hired riders, with the wall of fire creeping ever closer behind Merrick's men. The smoke had grown so thick that the sun appeared as nothing more than a dull red disk in the grey sky. Emma's eyes watered, and she could taste ash on her tongue with every breath. Colonel Merrick remained mounted, his face a mask of controlled fury. Crawford, you're making a mistake. This land has been legally purchased by the Kansas Pacific Railroad. These people are trespassers. Funny thing about that, Crawford called back, and Emma noticed he was holding a sheaf of papers in his weathered hand. We rode to the county seat this morning. Talked to Judge Harrison. Seems those railroad deeds you've been waving around? They're not quite as legal as you claimed. A murmur ran through both groups. Merrick's expression didn't change, but Emma saw his hand move slightly toward the rifle at his side. The Kansas Pacific bought the rights to lay track through this territory, Crawford continued, his voice carrying across the yard. But they didn't buy the homestead lands. Those deeds are still valid, still protected by federal law. Judge Harrison was very interested to hear about your burning campaign. Said it sounded an awful lot like land fraud and destruction of private property. Merrick's jaw tightened. Judge Harrison is an old fool who doesn't understand progress. The railroad is coming, Crawford, with or without his blessing. With or without your permission. Maybe so, Crawford acknowledged, but it won't come by burning families out of their homes. And it won't come by hunting down innocent people like animals. He gestured toward Mankato, who still stood beside Emma on the porch. That man you're chasing? He's guilty of nothing except trying to survive on land that was his people's long before any of us arrived. He killed 2 of my men, Merrick said coldly. Did he? Mrs. Johnson spoke up from her horse, her voice sharp. Or is that just another one of your lies? Because my husband saw those 2 men you're talking about. They're alive and well, working at your camp near Dodge City. We all know what you're really doing, Merrick. You're clearing the valley of anyone who might resist. Native people first, then anyone else who won't sell cheap. Emma felt Mankato tense beside her. She glanced at him and saw something flicker across his face, relief mixed with vindication. He hadn't killed anyone. Just as he'd said, Merrick's horse shifted restlessly, sensing its rider's agitation. You people are fools. You're standing on the wrong side of history. The railroad represents civilization, progress, the future of Kansas. What are you defending? A handful of dirt farms that barely produce enough to keep you alive? A fugitive who belongs to a dying way of life? We're defending our homes, Crawford said simply. Our right to live on land we worked for, paid for, and built with our own hands. You call that foolish? I call it American. For a long moment silence fell over the yard, broken only by the distant roar of the fire and the nervous shifting of horses. Emma could feel the weight of what was happening, the way history was balancing on a knife's edge right here in her yard. Then Deputy Carson, who'd been sitting quietly on his horse, spoke up. Colonel, maybe we should think about this. These are armed men defending their property. If we start shooting, a lot of people are going to die, including some of ours. Are you questioning my authority? Merrick snapped. I'm questioning whether this is worth dying for, Carson replied, and Emma heard something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Doubt. I signed up to keep the peace, not to murder homesteaders for refusing to sell their land. Several of Merrick's other men shifted in their saddles, exchanging glances. Emma realized that Carson wasn't alone in his hesitation. These weren't soldiers following orders. They were hired hands, men who'd taken money to intimidate and frighten, but who maybe hadn't signed up for a full-scale battle against their neighbors. Merrick seemed to sense the weakness spreading through his ranks. His face darkened further. Any man who rides away now won't see another cent from me. You'll be blacklisted from every railroad camp from here to California. That's a risk I'm willing to take, Carson said. He holstered his rifle, turned his horse, and rode away through the smoke. 2 other men followed him immediately. Then 3 more. Within minutes, half of Merrick's riders had abandoned him, leaving him with less than 10 loyal men against 30 armed homesteaders. But Emma knew that didn't mean they were safe. Merrick's face had gone from red to white, his eyes cold and empty as winter sky. This was a man who'd built his reputation on control and fear, and he was watching both slip away in front of everyone. You've made your choice, Merrick said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying across the yard. All of you, you're choosing to stand with savages and traitors against civilization itself. History will judge you harshly. Let it, Crawford replied. I'd rather be judged by history than by my conscience for what you've done. Merrick stared at them all for another long moment. Then, without another word, he jerked his horse's reins and galloped away, his remaining men following. They disappeared into the smoke like ghosts, leaving only the thunder of hoofbeats fading into the distance. The moment they were gone, the tension broke like a snapped bowstring. Emma's legs went weak, and she had to grab the porch railing to keep from falling. Mankato steadied her with a hand on her arm. It's over, she whispered, not quite believing it. The standoff is over, Crawford corrected, dismounting and approaching the porch. But the fire's still coming. We need to move fast if we're going to save your place. Emma looked past him at the wall of flame, now less than a mile away and advancing steadily. The heat was already making the air shimmer. How? We can't stop that. No, but we can redirect it. Crawford turned to the assembled homesteaders. Everyone grabbed tools from the barn. We're going to cut a fire break along the creek bed. If we can channel the fire around Emma's property, it'll burn itself out when it hits the water. The next 2 hours became a blur of desperate activity. Men grabbed shovels, hoes, and axes from Emma's barn and began clearing a wide strip of land along the creek, pulling up grass and scrub brush, creating a bare earth barrier between the cabin and the approaching flames. Women and children hauled water from the well, soaking the cabin's walls and roof. Emma worked alongside them, her hands blistering, her lungs burning from smoke and exertion. Mankato worked harder than anyone, despite his still healing injuries. He seemed to have an instinct for where the fire would move, directing people to reinforce weak spots in the firebreak, pointing out wind shifts before they happened. Emma realized he'd probably fought prairie fires before, back when his people had lived freely on these lands. The fire reached Emma's property line just as the sun began to set. The wall of flame towered 20 feet high, roaring like a living beast, consuming everything in its path. The heat was so intense that everyone had to fall back behind the firebreak, watching helplessly as the fire swept toward them. For a terrible moment, Emma thought their efforts had been for nothing. The flames seemed to leap across the bare ground they'd created, reaching for the cabin with hungry orange fingers. But then the wind shifted just slightly, and the fire followed the path of least resistance, away from the creek, away from the cabin, following the remaining dry grass eastward. They'd done it. The cabin was still standing, untouched except for scorch marks on the eastern wall. Emma's property was a blackened island in a sea of ash, but it was still hers. As the immediate danger passed, the homesteaders began to gather in Emma's yard, exhausted and smoke-stained but alive. Mrs. Johnson brought out food she'd packed, bread and cheese and dried apples. Someone produced a jug of water that tasted like the sweetest wine Emma had ever imagined. Crawford sat down heavily on Emma's porch steps. Well, he said, his voice hoarse from smoke, that's not how I expected to spend my Tuesday. Emma sat beside him, and Mankato settled on her other side. The three of them watched the fire continue its march eastward, away from them now, beginning to burn itself out as it ran out of fuel. "What happens now?" Emma asked quietly. "Now we rebuild," Crawford said. "The Johnsons lost their barn. The Pattersons' house is gone. But we're all alive, and we've still got our land. That's something." "And Merrick?" Crawford's expression darkened. "Merrick's got powerful friends. This isn't over. But what we did today, standing together, refusing to be intimidated, that matters. Word will spread. Other valleys, other homesteaders will hear about it. Maybe some of them will find the courage to stand up too." "He called me a traitor," Emma said, glancing at Mankato, "for helping someone who needed it." "Then I guess we're all traitors," Crawford replied with a tired smile. "And I'm proud to be counted among them." As darkness fell, the homesteaders began to drift away, heading back to assess the damage to their own properties. Crawford promised to return in the morning with supplies and help. Mrs. Johnson hugged Emma fiercely before leaving, whispering, "Your parents would be so proud of you." Finally, Emma and Mankato were alone again, standing in the yard of the cabin that had somehow survived. The air still smelled of smoke, and ash drifted down like grey snow, but the stars were beginning to appear through the haze. "You should leave tonight," Emma said. "While you have the chance. Merrick won't give up. He'll come back." "I know," Mankato agreed, "but I wanted to say goodbye properly. And to give you this." He reached into his shirt and pulled out something wrapped in soft leather. When he unfolded it, Emma saw a small carved figure, a bird in flight made from pale wood and decorated with intricate patterns. "My grandfather made this," Mankato said. "It represents freedom and the courage to seek it even when the path is dangerous. He gave it to me when I was young, and it has protected me through many trials. Now I want you to have it." "I can't take this," Emma protested. "It's too precious. That is why you must take it, to remember that what we did here mattered, that one person choosing kindness over fear can change the course of many lives." Emma closed her fingers around the carving, feeling its smooth warmth. "Will you make it to your sister?" "I will try. The path north is clearer now, and I will carry with me the memory of a young woman who looked at a stranger and saw a human being worth saving." They stood together in the starlight, two people from different worlds who'd found common ground in the most unlikely place. Then Mankato picked up the pack Emma had prepared for him days ago, shouldered it, and walked toward the creek bed. At the edge of Emma's property, he turned back one last time. "Emma Harper," he called softly, "and may your land always be as strong as your heart." Then he was gone, melting into the darkness and the burnt grass like he'd never been there at all. Emma stood in her yard for a long time after he'd left, holding the carved bird and watching the stars multiply overhead. The valley was scorched and blackened, her neighbors were displaced, and Colonel Merrick was still out there somewhere plotting his next move. But they'd stood together. They'd refused to be moved, and somehow, impossibly, they'd won. It wasn't the end of the story. Emma knew that. There would be more battles, more struggles, more hard winters and unforgiving summers. But standing there in the ash and starlight, she felt something she hadn't felt in the 8 months since her parents died. Hope. The prairie wind picked up, carrying away some of the smoke, and Emma turned back toward her cabin. There was work to do tomorrow. Fences to mend, gardens to replant, a community to help rebuild. But tonight, she would sleep in her own bed, in the home her parents had built, on the land that was still hers. She climbed the porch steps, paused to touch the doorframe, scarred but standing, and went inside. As she lit the lamp and closed the door behind her, Emma Harper smiled. The fire had tried to consume everything, but some things she'd learned were stronger than flame. Some things endured.